You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.
You are listening to Christian Audio's production of Between Heaven and the Real World, My Story, by Stephen Curtis Chapman with Ken Abraham. This book is read by Paul Michael. Chapter 2, Unresolved Chords. When I'm writing a song, my natural tendency has always been to resolve the last chord, to bring it back to the one chord, as we say in Music City. There have been a few occasions when I got a little adventurous and decided to leave the last chord unresolved, but for the most part, I think resolution is just in my DNA. The musical concept of resolution basically means bringing a song to its natural and most obvious conclusion, that place where it seems to most naturally want to return, bringing the tension to an end. Music is like life in many ways. There are fast songs for when we're happy and slow songs for when we're sad or feeling introspective, or maybe even romantic. And those songs are made up of chords, a collection of individual notes arranged in such a way that they bring order and give a sense of movement and direction to the music. It's as if the song is a journey, full of twists and turns, hills and valleys, all leading to a final destination. The resolution is crossing the line that says, "This is done. I'm coming back home," and feeling the release that comes with it. The resolution is the answer to the question, the period at the end of the sentence. I like resolution in my life, a lot, and I strongly dislike things I can't resolve or fix, and for good reason. As I share about my childhood, it's important for me to say how grateful I am for my parents and how important it is that I honor them in telling my story. I've asked their permission to share some of the details of our family's story that I know they wish they could change. I'm proud of them and thankful for many of the choices they made that helped shape me into the person I am. They are both amazing people, and I'm grateful for their willingness to let me share honestly. I know it's their hope and prayer that God might be able to use their story, the good, the bad, and even the ugly, to encourage others on their own journeys. One of the amazing things about our God is how He can take even the broken parts of our stories and bring about something beautiful as we trust Him with them. I was born to bring resolution, to tie up loose ends, to help, and if at all possible, to single-handedly fix whatever was broken in my world. From conception, it seems like my life was to be defined by fixing broken things, broken situations, and broken people. Prior to my birth, my mom and my dad found themselves at a crossroads and had to make a tough decision. Judy Rudd was a beautiful, bright-eyed country girl who was barely 16 years old when she met Herb Chapman, who was 19, handsome, played a guitar, and drove a cool car. Herb knew this girl was different from the ones he'd dated before, and he used to tell me the story of how one night after a date he knelt down under a tree in his backyard and prayed, "God, would you please let me marry that girl?" With the same engagement ring his dad gave his mom years earlier, Herb asked Judy to be his wife a few months after they met. She said yes, but soon began to question if she was ready to make the commitment of a lifetime. As the two young people were still in the process of trying to figure out where their relationship was headed, Judy discovered she was pregnant. Thankfully, they made the frightening but brave decision to get married and raise the little boy that would come along 8 months after the wedding. Herb Chapman, Jr. was born on June 2nd, 1960. Probably to more easily differentiate between father and son, Judy and Herb called their baby boy Herbie, and most people have done the same ever since. The young couple tried to figure out life together. It was a rocky beginning, to say the least. After about a year and a half of intense struggle in their marriage, Judy and Herb came to another crossroads. Should they divorce and go their separate ways? Somewhere in the discussion, Herb, my dad, suggested that maybe they should try having another child, on purpose this time, to see if that might make a difference and help save their marriage. They chose the latter course of action, thankfully. Judy got pregnant again, and on November 21st, 1962, Stephen Curtis Chapman came riding in on a white horse to save the day. I was literally conceived to help fix my parents' marriage. Obviously, I had no idea of all that was going on between Mom and Dad at the time. As crazy as this sounds, Herbie and I didn't even know that he was conceived before my parents were married until we were in our 30s. We had never even given it a thought or done the math. But years later, learning the backdrop to my arrival on the Chapman family scene helped me connect the dots in many ways. I was the fix-it kid, and for most of my early life I filled that bill relatively well. I was the compliant and happy child who was always smiling with my mouth wide open. I grew up in Paducah, Kentucky, a river town of around 25,000 people located just off Interstate 24 in the southwestern corner of Kentucky. It was the home of a U.S. uranium enrichment facility and a hub for the Illinois Central Railroad. Right after high school, my dad had gone to work for the railroad where his mother and many of my relatives worked. His real love, however, was music, and a few years after I was born, he was able to fulfill his dream of owning a music store. After injuring his back at work, he quit his railroad job, rented space in an old office building for $35 a month, and opened Chapman Music in Mayfield, a small town about 30 miles from where we lived. With no business education or training, but lots of hard work and determination, his small business began to grow. Self-taught with his own style, Dad was a great guitar player and a great singer. But his real forte was teaching guitar. Since he had no other employees at the store, he opened late, usually around 2 p.m., and stayed open late to accommodate his clientele. The unusual hours were mostly due to Dad's teaching business. Sometimes he wouldn't go into work until noon, because most of his students came after school or work. And then he stayed at the store until after 9 or 10 o'clock every night. Dad often got home long after I'd already gone to bed. Consequently, Mom, Herbie, and I saw Dad mostly on the weekends. Mom and Dad's relationship had been rocky from the start, and the fact that Dad's work schedule left Mom alone much of the time to raise 2 young boys probably created even more tension. Dad's upbringing didn't help either. He was determined to be a good dad, and he was. But his father had abandoned their family when my dad was just a boy, leaving him without a strong example to follow when it came to knowing how to love and lead a family well. Money was sometimes tight, and family vacations were non-existent, other than an occasional Saturday fishing trip. Dad worked hard to provide for our family, and Mom helped to make ends meet by working outside the home at Curtis and May's photography studio. My earliest memories are of a relatively happy home. When we were all together, however, it often seemed like Dad had a lot on his mind, and it didn't take much to light his short fuse. He had undergone surgery on his back after his injury at the railroad. Unfortunately, the surgery had not rectified the problem entirely, so Dad lived with the added stress of chronic back problems. Fights between Mom and Dad were fierce and flared quickly. Dad sometimes punctuated his statements by slamming the door in a rage. Mom would usually end up in tears. The arguments never got physical, although I recall seeing my dad throw a bowl of coleslaw across the room. It wasn't thrown at anyone so much as thrown out of frustration. Still, that sort of outburst can have an effect on young boys, and it did on Herbie and me. We were really sad and really scared and felt like we were walking on eggshells any time Mom and Dad started arguing. A few times the arguments increased in intensity to the point where Dad stormed out of the house, slammed the door, climbed in his car, and drove off. Mom was crying, Herbie was crying, and I stood at the kitchen door crying and thinking, Dad, please don't go. Please don't go. I had no idea whether Dad would ever return. Thankfully, each time he came back. In fact, usually he wouldn't go far, but sometimes he'd be gone for several hours and wouldn't come back home until after Herbie and I were in bed. Meanwhile, Mom tried to calm Herbie and me with her reassuring words. Your dad is a good man, and your dad loves you. We're struggling right now, but it is not because of you. Both Mom and Dad love you. Mom's words were meant to soothe our anxious minds, but nothing really helped until we saw or heard Dad coming back through the door. Dad was not a mean man, far from it, but he carried a heavy load of shame and anger, much of which stemmed from his own hard childhood, and he had few emotional or psychological tools to help him deal with it. His own dad was an alcoholic and had left the family when Dad was only 3 years old. His mom worked hard, trying to support the family, so she was not home much either. Apparently, when Dad and my Uncle Barry were young, some people suggested to their single mother that they should be sent away to a boys' home or an orphanage, a fact Dad didn't share with me until recently. My determined grandmother would have nothing to do with that idea. Eventually, Dad's grandparents moved in with his mom, and together they raised my dad and my uncle. But Dad never lost the sense of shame and embarrassment he felt about being abandoned by his own father. Because Mom and Dad both worked outside the home, Herbie and I sometimes were cared for by babysitters. When Herbie started attending elementary school during the day, I had to spend a few days a week at a local daycare center. There I encountered my own first traumatic experience of shame, and it left an indelible impression on my heart and mind. To this day, when I see a child being shamed in public by an angry parent, or hear a child crying and see a parent responding with frustration instead of kindness, it can reduce me to tears. I think it has something to do with what I experienced at Kitty Camp. Not the real name. Kitty Camp Daycare Center had a cute name, but for a little boy, the place seemed more like a prison camp. If a child was lying in a crib or on a mat, and his or her leg happened to hang off the mattress, an attendant would come by and whack the child with a paddle. "Get your leg back on the bed," the warden would growl. The food was awful too, but the rule was that we had to clean our plates completely or we'd be disciplined, usually with the paddle. I can still taste the flavor of the sticky, candied yams, yucky sweet potatoes they served. I hated those yams, but if I didn't eat them, I knew I'd be paddled. So, one day when nobody was looking, I took my yams and stashed them under the table by pressing them against the underside of the tabletop. For a moment I worried about being caught. What am I going to do if the yams don't stick? How am I going to explain dropping my yams under the table? But the yams were so sticky that they bonded firmly to the underside of the table. They may still be under the table for all I know. One day it was discovered that a little boy named Aaron had not washed his hands before eating his lunch. A staff person pulled down the little boy's pants right there in front of everybody and spanked him on his bare behind. Aaron stood in the middle of the big room bawling his eyes out, possibly from pain or embarrassment or both. I looked on in terror. I felt so sorry for him. Then the worst part came. "Look at Aaron's red butt," the attendant warned. "And if you don't do the right thing, you're going to end up with a red butt too." Embarrassed, I stared sheepishly at Aaron's behind, and sure enough, it was beet red. I thought to myself, oh no, I do not want to get in trouble. The message was clear to me. Don't screw up. It was one of the first times I felt a fierce commitment to stay safely between the lines and to please everyone as much as possible. I certainly didn't want to be that embarrassed and ashamed, so I was going to find out what was expected and what the rules were, and I was going to be good, even better than good. I was going to be Mr. Perfect. Even though I wasn't the boy who received the paddling, the impact of that shame was so powerful that I kept the incident to myself for years. When I finally told my mom years later, she was appalled and heartbroken. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" she asked. "I don't know. I guess because I thought that's the way bad kids were treated," I said. When I was old enough to attend school, Mom continued working at the photography studio, so most days Herbie and I came home to an empty house. I suppose we were latchkey kids, but since we rarely locked the doors where we lived, we weren't too worried about being locked out. Our house was located on 3 acres of our own property outside Paducah, with large 50 to 100 acre farms and fields all around us. A field planted with soybeans backed up right to our backyard. It was a young boy's dream, being able to play outside, go fishing in one of a couple ponds around our property, or ride a bike every afternoon until Mom came home from work. After school one day, Herbie and I were playing outside when we saw something that scared the daylights out of us. An airplane flying overhead suddenly dove right toward the roof of our house. It came so close that Herbie and I could see the propellers whirling. We raced toward the back door just as the plane streaked over our yard. "Watch out, Herbie! It's going to hit us!" We dove onto the ground and covered our heads to avoid being hit by the plane. Or so we thought. The plane pulled up and then circled around in the sky. Before we could even get up, the plane was diving toward our rooftop again. "He's trying to kill us!" I screamed. The next time the plane pulled up, Herbie and I made a beeline for the back door and ran inside the house. We called Mom, terrified. "Mom, there's an airplane. We don't know what's going on, but he's aiming right at our house and he's trying to kill us." "What?" Wait, Mom calmly said. "Crawl over to the window, look out, and tell me if something is coming out of the bottom of the plane when he flies over the field." "Yeah, it looks like water or white smoke or something." Mom chuckled. "He's not going to kill you. That's a crop duster, and he's spraying insecticide on the fields around our house." Reassured that the Russians were not invading Paducah, Herbie and I went out in the backyard and watched the plane repeatedly fly right over our house, now thinking it was the coolest thing we'd ever seen. As a little boy, I believed wholeheartedly anything my big brother told me. Herbie is 2.5 years older than me, so when he spoke, it had to be true. And it usually was, although at times he was prone to exaggeration. Herbie has always been a great actor with a flair for the dramatic, even at a young age. One day, while chopping down an old dead tree using a hatchet that Dad had just sharpened, Herbie took a swing and missed the tree, but hit himself in his knee, slicing all the way to the bone. His leg was immediately covered with blood. When Herbie saw the blood, he cried out, "I'm dying! I'm dying!" Mom came running and carted Herbie off to the emergency room, but as they drove off in a rush, I thought for sure I'd never see my brother again because, after all, Herbie, my big brother, had told me I'm dying. Of course, he didn't die, and the doctors patched him up. After a few days, he was back outside playing with me. Mom and Dad were strict with Herbie and me, but they didn't go overboard on discipline. Dad often simply cautioned us, "No goofing off, no foolishness, no horseplay." He never defined what that meant, but he didn't have to. We knew that included almost everything. As a kid, I felt afraid any time I sensed Dad's anger. I loved him, and I wanted to please him. I wanted to be around him. I wanted to be like him. But his anger was something that scared me. Like most country kids our age, Herbie and I didn't grow up with video games or 500 television stations to watch. We had 3 good stations if the weather was just right and the antenna was pointed in precisely the right direction. As a result, we used our imaginations and made our own games and entertainment outside. A lot of our creativity involved our bicycles. Like most other boys in the neighborhood, we practically lived on our Schwinn bikes. One of my best friends, Tom Lindsay, got a new bike for Christmas every year, and one of our favorite things to do was to set up some wooden planks on top of cinder blocks and then get a running start by pedaling like mad the length of the driveway, hit the ramp at full speed, and launch off the ramp Evel Knievel Daredevil style. Hey, we had seen Evel riding a motorcycle and jumping over 19 cars, so a bike jump was nothing. This was in the 1970s, long before BMX bike competitions existed in which similar jumps and much more difficult biker feats were commonplace. We were just jumping with regular two-wheelers and pedaling as fast as our short legs would take us. The trick, of course, was to get up to full speed and hit the plank in the center. Most importantly, the rider had to yank the front wheel up off the board at just the right moment to get the perfect launch as well as a good landing. Tom was the best ramp jumper around, and he had taught me how to do it. When Herbie came out and saw Tom make it look easy, he said, "Hey, I want to try that." Herbie hadn't done much ramp jumping, but he got a good running start down the driveway. He hit the plank just right and flew up the board, but he failed to pull the front wheel of his bike upward. From there, it was as though time stopped and everything that happened next looked like a slow-motion movie. I saw Herbie fly off the ramp, and then the bike came down with its full weight on the front wheel, catapulting Herbie forward and over the handlebars. He landed hard on the ground, with the bike bouncing off the front tire and back up into the air like a basketball, seemingly hanging in the air above him. Herbie tried to push himself up and scramble out of the way, but the slow-motion movie was still running, and the bike came crashing down right on top of Herbie's shoulder, pinning him back to the ground with a thud and a crunch. Herbie lay on the ground crying in a crumpled heap, holding his shoulder with the bike on top of him. He seemed to be alive, so I wasn't too worried about him, but I was real worried about me. Oh no, I thought. This is definitely going to qualify as foolishness and horseplay. If my big brother is hurt, I'm in trouble. Dad is going to find out that I set up the ramp and this whole thing was my fault. Tom and I helped Herbie get up, and for the next few minutes I did my best to convince my brother that he was okay and wasn't hurt. I knew Herbie could be dramatic. Besides, he wasn't bleeding as far as I could see, and he could walk, so I figured he'd survive. "You're okay, Herbie. You're not hurt. Shake it off." I tried everything I could to pump up my brother. "You're fine. Man, that was a great jump. You should have seen it. That was a really cool fall." Herbie wasn't buying it. He grimaced in pain and held his shoulder. Tom and I helped Herbie shuffle into the house and eased him down onto his bed. "You're fine, Herbie," I reassured him. "Can I get you some aspirin?" "Oh, it hurts so bad," Herbie said, raising his hand to his shoulder, milking the situation for all the sympathy he could get. "No, it doesn't hurt," I assured him. "It'll feel better in a little while." "No," Herbie wailed. "It hurts." I knew this was not going to work out well. When Mom came home, Herbie was still writhing in pain. "Oh my," she said, "we better go to the emergency room." Uh-oh, I thought. I'm dead. Mom hustled Herbie and me off to the hospital, where the doctors discovered that Herbie had dislocated his shoulder. They sent him home wearing a sling, so I knew there was no way we were going to be able to hide Herbie's injury from Dad. Sure enough, when Dad got home late that night, he came looking for me. I knew he was mad because when Dad got upset, he clenched his teeth together as he spoke. "Did you set up that ramp, boy?" he asked through his locked teeth. "Yes, sir," I said quietly, my eyes focused on the floor. "What'd I tell you about setting up those ramps?" "Not to." "Go out in the kitchen and wait for me there," Dad ordered. I knew I was in trouble. One of the reasons Dad was so strict with us was because he was so rambunctious as a boy himself. He was a rascal. He rode motorcycles when he was just a kid of 13 and did all sorts of reckless, crazy things. He once was towed along by a car with a rope because his motorcycle wouldn't run. He fell off the motorcycle and was dragged along on the highway, leaving him with a deep scar on his side to give weight to his story. It's a wonder he survived. He sometimes skipped school to go squirrel hunting and barely graduated. Because of his own mischievous childhood, Dad had a tendency to overreact with Herbie and me. He understood that boys will be boys and that most will sometimes do stupid things, but he worried constantly that we would do something foolish and get hurt badly. Consequently, he was always warning us about horseplay. I never knew horses to be such troublemakers, but I didn't question him. I've always had a great relationship with my dad, despite the fact that he was still trying to process issues from his own childhood. In fact, as we got a little older, he would often say that Herbie and I were two of his best friends. During my childhood, if Dad was doing a project, I wanted to be right beside him, helping him any way I could, learning from him, but most of all, just being with him. I loved being around my dad. As a boy, my dad gravitated toward music and hot rods. He always had a love for old cars and was a great mechanic in the days when cars had motors under the hood instead of computerized propulsion systems. To this day, he loves tinkering around in his garage. Dad had always wanted a Jeep when he was a kid, so when I was about 7 years old, he found an old 1947 Willys Jeep, similar to an Army Jeep, in a junkyard. The vehicle was in such bad shape that the wheels wobbled as he towed it up the driveway. Dad began a 1.5-year ordeal to restore that Jeep, working on it in any spare time he had, taking parts off and repairing or replacing them until the Jeep looked and ran like new. Throughout the process, I worked with Dad as often as I could, lying on my back under the Jeep while Dad did the actual work. My main job was trying to keep Dad from getting angry and frustrated. "I need a 9/16" wrench," Dad might say. I'd quickly slide out from under the Jeep and run to the tool shed where I'd scour through the toolbox drawers until I found just the right wrench. Then I'd run back and slide back under the vehicle while holding the wrench out for Dad. "Here you go, Dad." "Oh, just lay it there," he might say. "I don't need it anymore." The happy smile on my face would quickly fade as I realized he had fixed something without my help. "I could use a Phillips screwdriver," he'd say a few minutes later. Again, I'd race to the tool shed and return with the right screwdriver only to have Dad say, "Oh, I got it, never mind." Time after time, I'd run to the toolbox as fast as I could, find a tool, and run back only to have him say, "Never mind, I don't need it now." I was so bummed. I wanted so badly to be a help to my dad, but I couldn't seem to get it right. Once in a while, he would actually use the tool I brought him, and I'd feel a sense of great accomplishment. At times, Dad would ask me to hold the flashlight, which I would do. But after a while, I'd get bored and my concentration would lapse, and I'd shine the bright light right in Dad's eyes. That was never a good thing. Only as an adult and a father myself did I become suspicious that maybe Dad had sent me for tools only to give me something to do and to keep my little energetic self busy. Nevertheless, a few years ago, while watching a movie with my 2 boys called The Kid, starring Bruce Willis, I was undone by a scene in which the little boy finds the missing screw in his pocket that his dad had been looking for, and his dad becomes angry with him. The scene reminded me of how hard I tried to help my dad, how I'd wanted him to acknowledge me, and yet how often I had felt like I was just a frustration to him. I sobbed so hard in the movie theater during that scene that my son Caleb reached over and patted me on the back, trying to console me and minimize his embarrassment that his dad was crying his eyes out at a Disney movie. One of the most defining moments of my childhood took place one summer when I was helping Dad set up an above-ground swimming pool. It was only a 4-foot-high circular pool, but this was a big deal, and our entire family was excited about it. We were going to have a swimming pool right there in our backyard. We all pitched in to help. We had to clear the grass from a large spot, level out the ground with shovels, then lay a large piece of heavy plastic on the ground so the grass wouldn't grow up through the bottom of the pool. It took several days of work to get everything just right before Dad assembled the pool, and we watched excitedly as the water began to fill the blue plastic liner. While Dad was bent over and fiddling with the pool filter, I was playing with the pool skimmer, a basket at the end of an 8-foot-long aluminum shaft used to clean bugs and leaves off the surface of the water. I dipped the basket into the water and pulled it up quickly and was fascinated by the way the water flew out of the basket. the spray glistening brightly in the sunlight. Dad wasn't paying attention to my antics, so I kept plunging the basket deeper and deeper, playing in the water from over the edge of the pool wall, splashing the basket over and over. On one stab of the skimmer into the water, I pushed down too hard and hit the bottom, and the light aluminum shaft bent in half. Dad wasn't watching, so I quickly brought the shaft up out of the water and tried to bend it back so it would be straight again. But as soon as I bent the shaft back, the light aluminum pole snapped, breaking completely. "Oh, no," I whispered to myself. There was no way I could fix that aluminum pole. "Dad," I said, barely breathing as I held up the skimmer to show him. Dad raised up from where he was working. As soon as he saw the skimmer, his face stiffened, his jaw locked, his mouth pursed, and he spoke tersely through his clenched teeth. Dad's words devastated me. He said some things I had never heard him say. What he basically said, or at least what I heard, was, "What an idiot. How dumb can you be? Use your head. Think. Any numbskull would know better than to do something like that." The shame associated with his words seared into my memory. Although I didn't fully realize it at the time, I think I resolved at that moment, if you can't do something well and do it right, then don't even attempt it, because you don't ever want to hear those words again, and you don't ever want that feeling again. It was as though I wrote a mental note to myself. Be very careful. Don't mess up. The ramifications of that boyhood experience have haunted me throughout my life. Years later, I was part of a men's group called The Stories We Live By, along with a friend, Al Andrews. Al led the discussion and asked a poignant question. When do you first remember tragedy entering your story? Some of the guys told stories about losing a parent, incidents of child abuse, drunken parents, and all sorts of other horrendous things experienced in their childhoods. As I listened, I said to myself, maybe I should give up my spot to somebody who's experienced something hard. I don't have anything like that in my past. I was glad for that, but after our group met one morning, I was sitting in my car rehashing what I'd just heard. I wondered, what am I going to talk about when it's my turn to tell my story? I remembered the incident with the pool skimmer, and I suddenly started sobbing uncontrollably. There I was, as a full-grown adult, weeping over that childhood experience. I've come to realize over the years that my early experiences shaped me more than I ever imagined. Or maybe I've come to understand a lot more about how profoundly early experiences shape us into the people we become. It's certainly proven true for me. I love my dad and honor him to this day. He was and is a great man in my eyes. He did his best, and I know he never wanted to hurt me. Just the opposite. He was always trying to teach me how to be a man, although what that meant to him might be different from what it means to many people today, and I learned many important truths from him. My dad, Herb Chapman Sr., influenced me more than anyone in the world in my love for music, as well as what it means to live as a man who desires to honor God with his life. So, nearly 40 years later, I asked him about that pool skimmer incident and, more specifically, his response. Ironically, he barely remembered. So I reminded him of his words and told him I had come to realize how deeply they had affected me. He was truly sorry to know his words had hurt me. He went on to talk about the heavy burden of latent anger and shame that he carried around through much of his life. He apologized to me for allowing that anger to influence some of his words and actions during my early years. He loved his family and really tried to be a good dad to his boys. He took us hunting and fishing, and in many ways he was breaking the chains that had been wrapped around him since his own childhood. He was, after all, working hard to put in a swimming pool for us when that incident occurred. The pool wasn't for him. It was for us. I understood that Dad wasn't being malicious by what he had said or done, but his actions had a profound impact on me that I still deal with to this day. Even as I'm typing this and remembering the power of shame in my life and in my dad's life, I have tears in my eyes. Maybe I always will. Until the day I first step into heaven, and God fixes what I've never been able to fix.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.